The Pacific sky was bleeding red. It was late 1943, somewhere above the Solomon Islands, where the air shimmered with heat and death. The sun hung low, blinding, reflecting off the rippling sea that stretched endlessly below. From the haze, a streak of silver cut across the horizon, a Japanese Zero, its wingtips peppered with bullet holes trailing smoke. The pilot's breathing was heavy, his hands trembling on the stick. He had seen this before, the sudden flash of blue, the thunder of guns, and then nothing. He banked hard, searching the clouds. But the hunter was already behind him. A dark silhouette rose from the glare, almost invisible until it was too late. The last thing he saw was a set of white stars on a Navy fuselage, and beneath the cockpit the painted grin of a Hellcat. When the rounds struck, they didn't come in a burst. They came like a hammer. The Zero disintegrated mid-air, scattering pieces into the sea below. The blue aircraft climbed, its engine howling into the dying light. To the Japanese pilots, it became something almost mythical. The Blue Death, a machine that had no right to exist, faster, tougher, and somehow always one step ahead. The Americans called it the F6F Hellcat, the successor to the struggling Wildcat that had been torn apart in the early months of the war. But to the men of the Imperial Navy, it was the first true sign that Japan's reign of the skies was ending. At first they didn't understand. The Zero had ruled for years, dancing circles around clumsy American planes. It was lighter, more agile, more graceful. But now something was different. Dogfights that once ended in easy victories were turning into desperate fights for survival. Pilots who once returned triumphant now vanished without a trace. Rumors spread through the squadrons like wildfire. Some said the Americans had created a monster, an aircraft that could absorb punishment no Zero could deliver. Others whispered that the pilots inside were something else entirely, men trained not just to fight, but to outthink their enemies. But what none of them knew was that the secret behind the Hellcat's rise wasn't mystical at all. It was a secret born in the design rooms of Grumman, forged in the heat of necessity, and hidden behind layers of armor and innovation. This was the plane that would break Japan's aerial dominance, not because it was faster or even prettier, but because it was smarter. As the wreckage of another Zero vanished beneath the waves, the message was clear. The hunter had become the hunted. And somewhere, in that endless expanse of Pacific sky, one question lingered among the survivors. Heber, would you have seen it coming? In the early months of 1942, the Pacific was a graveyard of American ambition. Island after island fell under the rising sun, its red insignia painting the skies in every direction. The Japanese Zero ruled above it all, swift, agile, and nearly untouchable. In those first encounters, U.S. pilots faced an enemy that seemed to defy the laws of flight itself. The Zero could climb faster, turn sharper, and kill before its target even realized it was being hunted. At Midway, Coral Sea, and Wake Island, American aircraft were shredded by Zeros that danced around them like ghosts. The pilots of the aging F4F Wildcat fought bravely, but bravery couldn't match physics. In the words of one U.S. ace, it was like trying to knife fight a phantom. Back home, the Navy's design bureaus were desperate. Every report from the front told the same story. Japan's Mitsubishi A6M0 was lighter, deadlier, and terrifyingly efficient. The solution wouldn't come from a laboratory or a politician. It would come from a small team of engineers in Bethpage, New York. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had already built the rugged Wildcat, a plane loved by its pilots for one reason. It brought them home alive. Now they were tasked with designing something entirely new, not just a replacement, a reckoning. Their lead designer, Leroy Grumman, understood the stakes. He knew the next plane had to do more than match the Zero. It had to crush it. His team began working in secrecy through long nights, sketching designs on drafting tables while the war raged across the ocean. They weren't chasing beauty or grace. They were building a machine for survival, a predator in blue steel. Meanwhile, Japan celebrated its victories. To them, the Zero was a divine creation, the embodiment of Bushido in flight. It had been untouchable for so long that its pilots believed nothing could surpass it. Their air doctrine was built around that confidence. One-on-one combat, elegant turns, precision flying. But war, as history always proves, punishes arrogance. As 1943 dawned, the United States had begun to rebuild. Shipyards thundered day and night. Factories awakened with the sound of rivets and engines. Across the Pacific, a quiet shift was underway. America's industrial machine was no longer stumbling. It was roaring to life. And in one unremarkable hangar in Long Island, the roar would take shape. Engineers were crafting a new fighter that looked heavier, slower, even clumsy to the untrained eye. But within its frame lay something radical: power, protection, and vision. The Japanese didn't know it yet, but the balance of the air war was already tipping. The Zero's reign would not end in a single battle. It would die the moment the Hellcat took to the skies. The Pacific was about to meet its new hunter. By the spring of 1943, the Pacific Air War had entered a deadly rhythm. Dogfights raged daily above scattered islands whose names few Americans could pronounce: Bougainville, Rabaul, Guadalcanal. Each encounter was a brutal equation of altitude, sunlight, and seconds. For every American pilot who survived, there were 5 who didn't. The Japanese Zeros still commanded fear in every briefing room, every flight deck, every prayer whispered before takeoff. But change was coming, carried across the ocean inside wooden crates marked F6F-3. The first Hellcats arrived aboard carriers like the USS Essex, their wings folded neatly, their deep blue paint glinting under the Pacific sun. At first glance, many pilots weren't impressed. Compared to the sleek Wildcat or the elegant Corsair, the Hellcat looked bulky, almost crude. It seemed less like a bird and more like a blunt instrument, a hammer meant for the sky. Yet those who flew it knew better. The moment the engine roared to life, something felt different. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, 18 cylinders of raw fury, gave the Hellcat a growl unlike anything else in the fleet. Its frame, thick and heavy with armor, could absorb punishment that would have torn a Zero apart. And hidden beneath that armor was the beginning of its secret advantage: a new way of seeing. For the first time, American pilots could rely on something beyond reflex. The Hellcat's visibility was unmatched, a panoramic canopy that gave its pilot eyes on nearly every angle of attack. Add to that a rugged self-sealing fuel system, foldable wings for carrier operations, and firepower that could shred aluminum in seconds. 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns synchronized like a single heartbeat. But the engineers at Grumman hadn't built this aircraft just to win duels. They built it to survive them. They understood something Japan had not: that wars of attrition are not won by aces, but by machines that bring ordinary men home to fight another day. Back in Japan, intelligence officers began hearing disturbing reports. American planes that refused to die, Zeros riddled them with bullets, only for the blue aircraft to limp away, still flying, still fighting. The enemy was learning. Worse, adapting. The first missions with the Hellcat were limited, escort runs, small-scale strikes, but every engagement carried whispers of something new. Pilots returned with claims that seemed impossible. It climbs like a demon. It dives faster than gravity itself. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy dismissed these as propaganda. The Zero had been the pride of Japan for too long. Yet in the South Pacific, Japanese pilots were starting to notice the truth. The new American fighter wasn't just surviving, it was dominating. And as the months passed, the Zero's invincibility, the myth that had carried Japan through its early triumphs, began to fracture. The hunter's shadow was growing larger. The Hellcat was waiting, and soon it would strike. It began over the Philippine Sea. June 19, 1944, the day the skies themselves seemed to catch fire. To the men who were there, it would forever be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, though no one felt like laughing then. Before dawn, the decks of 15 American carriers thrummed with life. Mechanics fueled and armed hundreds of Hellcats, their blue fuselages lined in perfect rows, glinting under floodlights. Pilots climbed into their cockpits, adjusting oxygen masks, checking the 6 heavy Brownings that waited under their wings. The Pacific wind was hot and sharp. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japan's remaining air power was preparing to strike back. For months, the Imperial Navy had been pushed further and further west, their pilots exhausted, their fuel reserves dwindling. But they still believed in the Zero, and they had one final chance to prove its supremacy. Hundreds of aircraft lifted off from their carriers, white suns painted on their wings rising into the morning light. They were coming for the American fleet. The first radar contacts appeared on the Hellcat scopes just before noon. Hundreds of enemy blips, a swarm moving fast. The call crackled through the radio. Enemy inbound, Angels 20. Hellcat squadron scrambled from their decks, roaring into the open sky. High above the ocean, the two forces met. The Zeros came first, sleek and confident, diving from the sun. They still believed their speed and agility would carry the day. But the Hellcats didn't fight their way. They didn't turn and dance. They climbed, they rolled, they dove. Each pilot used the vertical space like a weapon, keeping the fight on their terms. The air exploded with tracers. Gunfire stitched across the sky, white smoke curling from shredded wings. Hellcats cut through the enemy formations like knives through silk. Where the Wildcat had struggled, the Hellcat dominated. In seconds, it became clear. This was not the same war Japan had begun. One by one, Zeros burst into flame, spiraling into the sea. American pilots, some fresh from training, were downing veteran aces in seconds. They were astonished by their own survivability. The hits that once would have been fatal barely scratched the Hellcat's hide. The armor held, the guns roared, and the Pacific sky filled with falling red suns. By sunset, the ocean was littered with debris. Japan had lost more than 300 aircraft in a single day, the heart of its naval air arm. The Americans had lost barely a fraction. That day, the myth of the Zero died. But even among victory, one mystery lingered. Why did the Hellcat seem to anticipate its enemy's every move? How did its pilots react so fast, almost too fast to be human? The answer, as the Japanese would soon discover, was far more terrifying than they imagined. In the aftermath of the Philippine Sea, the Imperial Navy's intelligence division scrambled for answers. How had the Americans achieved such dominance, such precision? The reports from surviving pilots were contradictory and unbelievable. They spoke of Hellcats appearing from nowhere, guns already blazing, as if the enemy knew their flight paths in advance. Some swore that, even when they tried to ambush from behind, the blue fighters rolled out of reach before they could even fire. It felt less like a battle, more like a slaughter orchestrated from an unseen hand. The truth lay hidden not in the skies, but in a small humming device buried deep within the Hellcat's fuselage, an innovation so quietly introduced that most Japanese officers didn't even know it existed. The Americans called it the AN-AP-6 radar system, a compact marvel born from the same minds who had broken enemy codes and guided ships through the black of the Pacific night. While primitive by modern standards, in 1944 this technology was nearly science fiction. The Hellcat's radar could lock onto enemy aircraft in darkness, through cloud cover, even through blinding sunlight. It allowed pilots to track opponents before they could even see them. In the dead of night, where Zeros were forced to fly blind, the Hellcat's cockpit glowed faintly green, a spectral pulse guiding the pilot straight to his target. This was the deadly secret behind the Blue Death. The Japanese weren't just fighting men, they were fighting machines that could see through the dark. The F6F had become not only a weapon of muscle and steel, but of perception, the first true step into the era of technological warfare. In Tokyo, the revelations sparked disbelief and dread. Engineers pored over fragments of downed Hellcats, prying at shattered panels and torn wiring. What they found confirmed their worst fears. The Americans had entered a new dimension of combat. No longer was victory decided solely by skill or courage. It was being determined by science, by innovation and precision the Japanese could not match. For the pilots of the Zero, this realization came too late. They were still bound by a code of honor that valued close, personal combat, face-to-face duels where victory was as much spiritual as physical. But the Hellcat pilots fought a new kind of war, cold and calculated, fought at the edge of visibility and beyond the limits of human instinct. That night, as the surviving Japanese crews gathered on their carriers, they stared into the black horizon where their comrades had vanished. The sky that once belonged to them now felt foreign, haunted by unseen eyes and mechanical ghosts. What would you have done in that moment to know your enemy could see you when you could not see him? By late 1944, Japan's air war was collapsing under its own weight. The same pilots who had once ruled the Pacific were now outnumbered, outtrained, and outmatched in every encounter. The once proud squadrons of the Imperial Navy had become shadows of their former selves, flying outdated Zeros against a machine that seemed almost invincible. Every sortie felt like suicide. Hellcats prowled the skies in disciplined formations, 3, sometimes 4 abreast, moving with the coordination of a single organism. Their pilots, guided by radar and radio coordination, hunted with ruthless precision. Japan's pilots, meanwhile, were flying blind, their communications faltering, their tactics crumbling. The shift was psychological as much as tactical. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Zero since Pearl Harbor was gone. New recruits were barely trained, often sent into battle after only a few hours of flight time. They faced opponents who had hundreds of combat hours and machines that could take twice as much punishment. It wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't even the same kind of war anymore. At dawn over Formosa, one young Japanese aviator wrote in his logbook, "We cannot see them. We hear them. Then we die." By the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the imbalance was absolute. The Hellcat ruled the air. Radar control from American carriers directed squadrons like pieces on a chessboard, intercepting raids before they ever reached their targets. The F6F wasn't just a fighter now, it was the backbone of a system, a network of power that connected ships, pilots, and technology in perfect harmony. From above, Hellcat pilots could see everything. Enemy formations scattering, carriers burning, the Pacific turning to smoke and wreckage. Even when Zeros managed to score hits, the Hellcat's thick armor and self-sealing tanks refused to yield. Pilots who once feared flame and ocean now fought with a confidence bordering on inevitability. For the Japanese, it was the beginning of despair. Commanders turned to desperate measures, suicide missions, kamikaze strikes, and last-ditch tactics to stem the tide. But even those acts of sacrifice could not restore the balance. The Hellcat swatted them from the sky like flies, efficient, relentless, unyielding. The Blue Death had become more than a nickname. It was a prophecy fulfilled. The sky that had once belonged to Japan was now owned by the Hellcat, and every pilot knew it. In the silence after battle, with smoke curling over the horizon and the sea littered with wreckage, a few surviving Japanese pilots would look up through the haze and whisper to themselves, "How did it come to this? Can you imagine witnessing that? Watching your empire fall not to men but to machines that had outgrown you?" When the echoes of the Philippine Sea faded, the Pacific entered its final merciless phase. Japan's aerial empire was shattered. By early 1945, the Hellcat had carved a path of destruction so complete that even American strategists were astonished. In less than 2 years, the F6F had claimed over 5,000 aerial victories, more than any other Allied aircraft in the entire war. The balance of air power wasn't just tipped, it was obliterated. On every island, every carrier, the blue silhouette of the Hellcat became a symbol of inevitability. It wasn't glamorous like the P-51 Mustang, nor as fast as the Corsair, but it was unshakable, the workhorse of American victory in the Pacific. For Japan, the consequences were catastrophic. With their veteran aces gone and fuel reserves depleted, they turned to desperate measures. The once celebrated Zero was now forced into suicide roles. Kamikaze strikes that spoke more of tragedy than triumph. Young pilots, barely out of training, were strapped into planes with enough fuel for only a one-way flight. Their commanders told them it was the honorable path. In truth, it was the last gasp of an empire that had run out of options. The Americans, meanwhile, learned to respect the machine that had saved them. Pilots who once cursed the Wildcat's shortcomings now sang the Hellcat's praises. They called it the Ace Maker. Some said it forgave mistakes that would have killed them in any other fighter. Its thick hide, steady handling, and forgiving nature made even rookies deadly. But beneath the victory was a sobering realization. Technology had changed the nature of war forever. No longer was combat defined by the man in the cockpit alone, but by the systems guiding him, the information feeding him, and the science that made his survival statistically inevitable. As the war neared its end, Grumman engineers quietly began to look beyond the Hellcat. They were already sketching its successor, faster, sleeker, built for a new kind of sky where jet engines would soon scream instead of propellers. The age of piston-driven fighters was dying, just as surely as the empires they had once served. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the Hellcat's job was complete. From the first chaotic encounters in 1943 to the final strikes on Okinawa, it had proven one truth above all, that in war, adaptation is the greatest weapon of all. And on airfields across the Pacific, as mechanics powered down the last of their engines, the silence that followed felt almost sacred, a pause between eras, between the fury of what had been and the uncertainty of what would come next. The Blue Hunter had done its work. The skies were quiet again. The war ended as suddenly as it had begun, in smoke, silence, and surrender. Yet for the men who had lived it from the cockpit, the echoes of those battles never faded. The Pacific may have grown calm again, but in their memories the sky was still burning. And among all the aircraft that had ruled those deadly years, one remained etched in legend. Not for beauty, but for what it represented, the F6F Hellcat. It wasn't the fastest plane, nor the sleekest. It didn't capture imaginations the way the Mustang did over Europe. But in the Pacific, it was the plane. It was the turning point. The moment when the hunter became the hunted, when the United States finally broke the myth of the zero and reclaimed the skies one fiery battle at a time. In the end, the Hellcat destroyed nearly 75% of Japan's entire naval air power. Yet its true legacy wasn't written in numbers. It was written in what it changed. It showed the world that wars are not won by pride or tradition. They are won by innovation, by adaptability, and by the men who dare to trust the machines built for them. For the Japanese pilots who faced it, the Hellcat became something almost supernatural, a ghostly symbol of an enemy that had learned, evolved, and turned their own lessons back upon them. For the Americans who flew it, it was a guardian, a machine that could take punishment, carry them home, and give them a fighting chance to see another sunrise. After the war, many of those pilots returned to civilian life. Some never spoke of what they'd seen, but when they did, they always came back to one thing: how the Hellcat felt like more than metal and rivets. It was a companion, a shield, a second chance at survival in a sky where few got one. Today, when you see one gleaming in a museum hangar or roaring to life at an air show, it's hard not to imagine what it must have felt like to sit behind that canopy, engine rumbling beneath your boots, knowing that you carried the weight of a nation and the memory of every man who hadn't made it home. The Hellcat's secret wasn't just radar or armor, it was evolution, the understanding that survival depends on the courage to change. The Blue Death of the Pacific became the Blue Guardian of history. And as the waves roll quietly beneath those same skies, the question lingers, one as haunting as the first time that Zero fell from the clouds: do you think history could have gone differently?